All right, all. It's time to start looking at our unit test 2, and I have provided a review sheet for you that's found online. I thought I might just go through that quickly with you, give you some ideas about how to study these different concepts. But in Chapter 9, if you remember, Chapter 9, we talked about attention, and we defined what attention was. We talked about how attention is important for different motor skills and our ability to attend to information. And there were 3 different models of attention we talked about: um, fixed and flexible, central resource theories of attention. And basically, it's just these theories are trying to explain how we attend to information that comes into our senses. And so we talked about the filter theory, or what sometimes is called the bottleneck theory. We talked about the central resource theory, and the idea with central resources that you are able to attend to more than one thing at a time, but you do get to that point where you max out. And if you remember, we use Kahneman's model of attention as an example of a central resource theory. So it's a specific example of a central resource theory, and I gave you a handout on that with the diagram of Kahneman's model, and there were several different specific information on that handout. So I encourage you to find that handout or go to the textbook. In Chapter 9, there's a picture of the model, and make sure that you are very familiar with Kahneman's model of attention as an example of a central resource theory. Again, comparing and contrasting central resource theory to multiple resource theory, and we use Wickens' multiple resource theory. And again, I encourage you just to go to the handout I provided and be familiar with the difference between a central resource theory, which just says you have one central place where you are able to attend to information, versus the multiple resource theory, which basically states that we have multiple resources, which enables us to attend to lots of different things at any one time. Our ability then to do more than one thing, we call that dual task. And there's been research done where you have a primary task and a secondary task. And we've looked at how we're able to attend to more than one thing at a time. The second part of that chapter, chapter 9, we talked about visual attention and how we study for visual attention. And if you remember, we dealt with eye movements, which again is not the best way because it doesn't really record peripheral, but it is a way that we do study visual attention. Temporal and occlusion. So I go back to the textbook and review those 3 ways or 3 techniques that we use to study visual attention. With attention focus and how we perform motor skills, we talked about different dimensions. We talked about wide and narrow, internal and external. Make sure you review those concepts for types of attention. Ways that we attend. We attend broadly, we attend narrowly, we attend internally, and we attend externally. And we switch all the time our attention focus. We finished up the chapter talking about selective attention and how, as we work with clients or patients, how we can help them attend to the right information and not attend to irrelevant information. And then we finished up connecting visual search as it relates to open and closed motor skills. So that's our attention chapter. I recognize that I've just given you a brief overview, but I've tried to emphasize the things that you will need to know from chapter 9. Let's move on to chapter 10 now. And in chapter 10, that was the chapter on memory. And if you remember that lecture, we actually were in the science building. So if you remember the lecture on memory. It was when we were moved over to the science building for a day. We talked about the capacity, the function, and the structure of both working memory and long-term memory as it relates to duration, capacity, and how we process information, and how it's a dual directional relationship between working memory and long-term memory. We made distinctions between procedural memory, episodic memory, and semantic memories. We also talked about the difference between declarative and procedural knowledge. We talked about explicit versus implicit memory tests and how that relates to us remembering or forgetting. We talked about proactive interference and retroactive interference. So make sure you can make a distinction between what is retroactive interference versus what's proactive interference. We also finished up that chapter. We talked about strategies for remembering movement, and we tend to remember the endpoint, so we focus on follow through. We also location of movement, so we might use strategies such as comparing movement to like the hands of the clock, and I want my arm back at 9 o'clock, or I want my follow through at 2 o'clock. So review those strategies. And then if you remember, we talked about the encoding specificity principle as it relates to practice and tests. And we did our lab on the encoding specificity principle. So remember, the encoding specificity principle, the idea is the way we encode information, it's best retrieved the same way. So if we're encoding specific information a certain way, then that's the best way we can replicate or remember that information. So review that concept, encoding specificity principle. And that was a lab where we actually divided you, and you were random or block practice groups. And the idea was that in a random practice scenario, you would be better prepared for the real world of random practice. All right, moving on, chapters 13, 11, 12, 13. In 11, we defined learning, what it is. How is learning different than performance? We looked at the 4 performance curves, and make sure you're familiar with each of those learning or performance curves. And again, what's the difference between performance and learning? We spent some time looking at how people change over time, how a novice performs a skill, and what they might look like versus how an expert might. Performance characteristics as you go through the process of learning a skill. Again, you see, explain the various curves. That's on there twice. So you know that's important. Make sure you know the 4 performance curves, and you can explain each one in detail. The next chapter, in chapter 12, we looked at stages of learning. We looked at Fitz and Posner, 3 stages of learning. And then we looked at Gentile's 2-stage model. We talked a little bit about Bernstein. So be able to compare Fitz and Posner's 3-stage theory, Gentile's 2-stage theory, and what Bernstein has to say as it relates to the stages of learning a motor skill. Again, in this chapter, there was a whole series of changes that occur when a person goes from a novice to an expert. And we briefly talked about the research, but we came to the conclusion that research does not support the idea that if you're successful at the beginning of learning a motor skill, that will make you very successful later on. The only research that we know as far as correlation is the closer the skill trials are to each other, the more likely they are to be highly related. But as a general rule, research does not show someone who starts out, say, very, very successful. That does not necessarily mean as they progress and learn the skill, they will continue at a high level of success. Then when we got into transfer of learning, chapter talked about transfer of learning. That was chapter 13. And you just covered that chapter. But positive transfer, negative transfer, and there is a thing called zero transfer. Be able to explain those, give examples of those. And then we also, in that chapter, talked about bilateral transfer and the difference between symmetric and asymmetric. And then make sure you can explain why bilateral transfer occurs. We did not do the bilateral transfer lab, but if we had, you would have seen that, in fact, as you practice one limb, learning actually does transfer to the other limb. And so that's pretty strong evidence to support bilateral transfer learning. I know I've gone through that quickly. Just again, trying to remind you of some of the concepts we've talked about. I encourage you to go back to the chapters, answer these questions in much more detail, and you'll be ready to take that unit test later this week. Let me know if you have any questions.